of what became known as the global war on terror. Consider actually the Bush administration's second inaugural address. It was really something there. So this is George W. Bush speaking in January of 2005. And this was when he articulated what became known as the Freedom Agenda. If you've ever been to the Bush Presidential Library in Dallas, Texas, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There was a whole exhibit on it. So Bush says here, he says, quote, "Eventually the call of freedom comes to every mind and every soul." Bush spoke in January 2005. He continued, quote, "We go forward with complete confidence in the eventual triumph of freedom, not because history runs on the wheels of inevitability. It is human choices that move events. Not because we consider ourselves a chosen nation. God moves and chooses as he wills. We have confidence because freedom is the permanent hope of mankind, the hunger in dark places, the longing of the soul." This, in short, is absolute garbage. This is total philosophical gobbledygook. It is simply not true that freedom is, quote, the permanent hope of mankind. There are any number of cultures throughout the world, such as Sharia-observant, Sharia-abiding Islamist cultures, such as various sub-Saharan tribal African warlords. Frankly, when it comes to the ethnic Han supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party, as indicated by their soft genocide of the Uyghur Muslims out in Xinjiang province in western China, there are any number of cultures and civilizations that simply do not subscribe, as Bush famously, or infamously I should say, said, that freedom is the permanent hope of mankind. There is no universal longing of the soul for freedom. Rather, there is an idiosyncratic Western biblical inheritance premised upon the two great biblical religions of Judaism and Christianity. That is the reason that we sometimes mistakenly believe that our inheritance and our values are universal. But it was that inheritance, for instance, that gave Thomas Jefferson the moral confidence, the moral self-confidence to write that we hold some of these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He's essentially just taking Genesis 1:27. In Hebrew, we would say B'Tselem Elohim, the divine image imperative, imago Dei. In the Latin, this notion of man being made in God's image. That is the Western biblical ecumenical inheritance. And that is what Jefferson was relying on to famously write the Declaration, which we celebrate the 250th anniversary of this July 4th. So what is a more sober, a more restrained, a more Burkean conservative view of foreign policy and of America's role in the world and America's role on the world stage? Well, one of my favorite speeches, and I've definitely referenced it on the show any number of times, so I want to read from it again here because it's highly instructive. One of my favorite speeches on foreign policy and how Americans should think of it was given 200 plus years ago by a man who would become president shortly thereafter, John Quincy Adams. At the time, he was just serving as Secretary of State to President James Monroe. This is one of the most famous speeches on foreign policy. It's probably the greatest speech of John Quincy Adams's career. It's his 1821 Monsters to Destroy speech. So he is speaking here about how America ought to view the world here. And he says in relevant portion, quote, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be." Speaking about America. So there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. "But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own." So we only vindicate our own conception of liberty. That's the purpose of our rule of law. That is the purpose of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and on and on and on. But America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Again, what does that mean when it comes to American foreign policy today, when it comes to Iran and other issues? Well, I've got some thoughts on that. But for now, just a quick word from today's other sponsor, which is the upcoming film release, Pressure. So from Focus Features and the producers of Darkest Hour comes the new movie, Pressure, the untold true story of D-Day. In the 72 hours leading up to the largest seaborne invasion in history, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision that would determine the fate of the war. As Allied forces prepared to land, two massive storms converge over Normandy. Behind closed doors with the clock ticking, General Eisenhower must decide. Send 300,000 men into nature's unforgiving fury or delay and risk losing the war itself. There is no safe option, only consequences. One decision would change the world forever. This Friday, experience a powerful and inspiring story of courage, sacrifice, and the mission that gave the free world hope. Starring Andrew Scott, Brendan Fraser, Kerry Condon, and Damian Lewis. Pressure is filled with thrilling tension from beginning to end, and without a doubt, it must be seen on the big screen. Pressure, the untold true story of D-Day, is rated PG-13. It's only in theaters this Friday. Special engagements in Dolby Cinema as well. Folks, I have seen this film, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. I'm a history buff, and I learned a lot about the invasion of D-Day. So again, the film is Pressure, and it is being released on the big screen this Friday. Go ahead and check out the film. So D-Day, speaking of D-Day, is the quintessential involvement of American just foreign policy involvement overseas. But even in World War II, it is crucially worth noting that the actual reason that America directly got involved in World War II, as opposed to the more subtle under the table Lend-Lease agreement that America had with the British for some years prior to our formal entrance there, that was between FDR and Winston Churchill. The ultimate actual reason was because we were attacked. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor on what FDR referred to as a day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. It is an interesting counter-historical kind of intellectual inquiry. It is an interesting thought process as to whether or not America actually would have gotten involved in earnest in World War II had Pearl Harbor not happened. No one knows the answer. I don't know the answer. You don't know the answer there. Frankly, America knew about the depravities of the Nazi regime in Europe. They knew about the train tracks. They knew about the concentration camps. America certainly knew all about everything that Imperial Japan was doing there with the rape of Nanjing and its full-on conquering of large swaths of China and Southeast Asia. Imperial Japan, in many ways, was just as, at times, if not even more savage than the Nazis actually were on the European continent there. So who knows? But the point is that even then, even in what emerged as the most foundational conflict that actually really does evince this true moral dichotomy between good and evil, even then, even in this true dichotomy between literal, actual fascism, not what Greta Thunberg calls fascism, not what Kamala Harris calls fascism, no, like actual fascism, in this real standoff between actual evil, actual tyranny, actual fascism, and truth, justice, and the American way, even then, it actually took Pearl Harbor to actually commence and to get the United States to commit in earnest to actually fight this war to the very, very end there. Again, America, folks, does not go abroad, or we should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. When we act because there is a real threat to the American national interest. And we do so because we calculate the American national interest in a sober manner. We are not in hock to any kind of overt, fanciful ideology. We're not trying to export democracy like George W. Bush. We are also not saying that we live in a utopian universe where America, the great superpower, can simply duck her head in the sand and be done with the world. That is what Ron Paul wants. That is what Thomas Massey wants. That's what Tucker Carlson wants. That also is stupid. Frankly, that is just as stupid as what George W. Bush wanted. These are two sides of the same stupidity. The good news is that Donald Trump understands this and, generally speaking, has acted on this on the world stage. Well, I will explain what I mean by that and plenty more to get to. There's also a big primary in Texas tonight, folks. We got a lot more still to cover on today's show. We'll be right back after a short break. Stay with us.